Daf Mem Vav Amud Beis, 3 lines from the top. We're in the middle of a discussion as to why, once we have a rule, a principle that halach k'divrei mekel be'erev, that we paskin like the one who's mekel, regarding halachas of Eruvin, we paskin to the one who's mekel. Why do we have to paskin specifically that halachas like Rav Yochanan ben Nuri legabe the din, if a person was asleep on the onset of Shabbos, he didn't realize it was Shabbos, and nevertheless he has alpai mama l'chol ruach. That's a kula, and we have a principle halacha k'divrei mekel be'erev. Rav Papa suggested that there's a chilik between, I might have said there's a chilik between eruv chatzeres and tchumim. Then I might have thought that what we say, the halacha is k'divrei mekel be'erev, that's only by eruv chatzeres, but not by tchumim. That's why we have to say over here that halacha is like Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, even though it's legabe tchumim. And where do we see that there's a chilek between eruv chatzeres and tchumim? Why would I assume that? Why would I have thought that there is a chilek? We must have some precedent somewhere else that shows us that there is in fact a chilek, and we're mekel by eruv chatzeres and not by tchumim. It's not because we learned in the Mishnah, where is it said that you need a person's consent for an eruv medvar mamurim? That's by eruv tchumim. Aval by eruv chatzeres, by eruv chatzeres, ma'arvin ben ladas, ben shaloi ladas. Shezochen ladam shaloi befonav, ben achavin ladam mel befonav. So we see this chilek that we say to make a tchum for a person, you need his consent. Because sometimes a person wants to go more in one direction, sometimes he wants to travel in a different direction. It's not so clear that necessarily this is to his benefit. Now the general principle is if something which is a schus for him, a benefit for him, you don't need his consent, you can do it shaloi befonav. But ein chaven ladam lefonav. So tchumim is not necessarily something that is for a person's benefit. Maybe he doesn't want this tchum. Maybe he wants to be in the part of like a resident of the city. Maybe he wants to make a tchum in another direction and travel more in a different direction. So therefore he needs consent. By chatzeret, it's certainly a benefit. It's certainly a benefit for him. It allows him to carry in the chatzar. And there's no downside. So there you don't need his consent. So what do we see? We see legabe tchumim that you need a person's consent. We see by eruv chatzeres you don't need, so we're more mekel legabe that. So you might have thought that here also we make such a chilik. So therefore, since we see the halachas of eruv chatzeres and tchum are different, you might have thought that that's where we're mekel by eruv is by tchumim, and not by it's by chatzeres rather, and not by tchumim. That's what we have to say specifically. The halachas like Rav Yochanan ben Nuri. Ravashi gives another teres, another reason that I would have thought the halacha of k'divrei mekel by eruv, I would have thought that applies only in the specific case. And therefore it has to tell me that the halacha is like Rav Yochanan ben Nuri, even legabe the case that we're discussing over here. Because Ravashi Amar, I have to tell me, it's needed to tell me the halacha is like Rav ben Nuri, because I would have thought that what you say, the halacha is k'divrei hamekel be'erev, that's hanimil b'shiur erev. That's only with the remainder of the erev. That we're mekel, that we don't know if it has an erev, you put down an erev, and it had the shiur, it had the minimum amount, and now you don't know if it still has the minimum amount, there we're mekel. But in the case of placing an erev to begin with, there I might have thought that we're not mekel over there. I would have thought that the din of being mekel be'erev is only on the remnants, on the shiur erev, that you know you had a proper erev. Now the question is, do you still have the minimum amount of food that's required for the eruv? Then we say that if you had it to begin with, we can assume you still have the minimum amount. But in the placing of the eruv to begin with, maybe I wouldn't be mekel. That's why it has to tell me that Allah is like Yochanan ben Nuri. And where do we see that we differentiate between the initial placement of the Erev, and the Shiur Erev, and the remnants of an Erev. This now we learned in the Mishnah as follows: Amar Rav Yosi b'med dvarim amurim. When do we say that a minimum quantity of food is required for an Erev by Erev Chatzeres? That you need this minimum, that you have the shear of a minimum. That's b'tchilas Erev. That's in the beginning of an Erev. Aval b'shiur Erev, but in the remnants of an Erev, I feel a kolshu. Even a kolshu, even just a tiny, minute amount for each person is required. Initially, when you put the Erev at the beginning of the Erev, when you make the Erev, you have a minimum amount, either mazal shtei sudas, a groigers, kol echad echad, a groigers for each person, depending on how many people there are. But once you place the Erev, if that food got diminished, then as long as there's a kolshu, it's enough. That they said for Erev Chatzeres, that you need a minimum amount of food to begin with by Erev Chatzeres. That's only so the children won't be mistaken, and they won't say that you don't need a minimum amount of food for Erev Chatzeres. They'll think you don't need it for Tchumim either. Really, the Iker Takana for a minimum amount is by Tchumim. They only established that you have to have a minimum by Chatzeres, so that the tinoikas, the children, the young children, won't be mistaken and think that you don't need it for tchumim. But once you've established to begin with a proper eruv with a minimum amount, even if it gets diminished, it's kosher as long as you have a kolshu. So what do we see over here? We see that there is a chiluk between tchilas erev and shiur erev. So therefore, we might have said that the halachas kedivra mekel be'erev is only by shiur erev, but not by tchilas erev. That's why I had to say halacha Rav Yochanan ben Nuri. So we're discussing about certain guidelines and rules about who he paskin like. Now the Gemara is going to continue with other cases, other examples of where we say the halacha follows a certain opinion. Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Zreika, Amru, they said halacha Rabbi Akiva mechayvei roi. That when there's a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and another Tana, if it's Rabbi Akiva against a Yochid, it's a Yochid against a Yochid, then the halacha is like Rabbi Akiva. But not when it's Rabbi Akiva against the Rabbim. But Rabbi Yosi mechavei Rav, but the halacha is like Rabbi Yosi, even when he argues with the Rabbim. Rabbi mechavei Rav. It looks like Rabbi if it's one Tana that argues with him. So to what extent do we say when we say the halach is like Rabbi Akiva, the halach is like Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi, etc. Rabbi Yasi Amar halach, it means that it's halacha, that's halacha, and you can publicize this barabim. It's a clear-cut halacha. Rav Chia Barava Amar Matin, he says it's not a clear-cut halacha. We don't publicize it, but we can decide it in private. We say, depending on the circumstances, we lean towards this view. So, depending on the case, that we can lean towards this view and decide it in that favor. Rav Yosef Bar Chanina Amar Nirin. He says that not even in private do we say that this is halacha, but he says that it's nirin, meaning that there is a tzad to say that. There is something supporting this. And b'di'evid, if this was paskin this way, then we don't overturn it. But we don't publicize it. And even in private, we don't say that this is the halacha. But there is some support for it. And therefore, b'di'evid, if it was decided in this way, it's not overturned. He said a different set of guidelines. He said if it's a machlokes between Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda, halach Rav Yehuda. The halach is like Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda, Rav Yosi, halach like Rav Yosi. But it's Rav Yehuda against Rav Yosi, the halach is like Rav Yosi. Then Sarach Leimer, Rav Meir, Rav Yosi, halach Rav Yosi. And certainly, if the machlokes is Rav Meir and Rav Yosi, certainly the halach is like Rav Yosi. Hashtabim kain Rav Yehuda lesa madach. We say that Rav Yehuda against, if it's Rav Meir against Rav Yehuda, then the halach is not like Rav Meir. So if the halach is not like Rav Meir, even against Rav Yehuda, so certainly we would say that against Rav Yosi, that certainly the halach is not like Rav Meir. If Rav Meir, the halacha is not like him when he argues with Rav Yehuda. And if Rav Yehuda, Rav Yosi, the halacha is like Rav Yosi, and certainly if it's Rav Meir and Rav Yosi, the halacha is like Rav Yosi. So, Hashta b'mekayim Rav Yehuda, less b'mekayim Rav Yosi, boy, it's certainly not. Amar Rav Asi of Ani Loimet. He said, I can also learn out and apply a certain principle on certain klolim. Afani Loimet Rav Yosi, Rav Shimon, halacha Rav Yosi, that if it's a machlokes Rav Yosi, Rav Shimon, the halacha is like Rav Yosi against Rav Shimon. Why is that? How do I learn this out? How do I know this? Because the Amar Rav Abba, Amar Rav Yechina, and he said, Rav Yehuda, Rav Shimon, halacha Rav Yehuda. Well, if it's between Rav Yehuda and Rav Shimon, the halacha is like Rav Yehuda. Now, we already learned that Rav Yehuda and Rav Yosi, the halacha is like Rav Yosi. So now, if Rav Yehuda, if Rav Shimon is not Menaseach Rav Yehuda, if we pass him like Rav Yehuda against Rav Shimon, and we pass him like Rav Yosi against Rav Yehuda, certainly we would pass him like Rav Yosi against Rav Shimon. So Hashtem become Rav Yehuda lessa, b'mekayim Rav Yosi mibayas. So therefore, we can learn out that if it's a machlokes Rav Shimon, Rav Yosi, the halacha is like Rav Yosi. Iboilu Rav Meir, Rav Shimon mai. What about Rav Meir and Rav Shimon? Now, both of them, when they argue with Rav Yehuda, the halacha is like Rav Yehuda. What about Rav Meir and Rav Shimon? It's a take. Amar Rav Misharsha, lesson on the klal. He said, we don't apply these principles. We don't apply these rules. How does he know that? Maybe he'll say, we learned in the Mishnah, Rav Shimon, he said, what is the case in our Mishnah compared to when you have three people and their Dalet Amas are muvloim? The middle one is muvla with one on each side, but the one on each side on the extremes are not muvla with each other. So the Mishnah says that the middle one can carry with the one on each side to him, but the two on the sides cannot with each other. So Rav Shimon says, it's compared to a case where you have three chatzeres, which are open to each other and also open up to the streets. So in the same way, we say that the middle one, if they made an Erev with the middle one made an Erev which one to one on each side. The middle one can carry with the one on the side, and each one can carry with the middle one, but the ones on the sides cannot carry with each other. So he So that's what we learned in the Mishnah, and on that, from Rav Chama Bar Guria, Amar Rav, halacha Rav Shimon. He says the halacha is like Rav Shimon. Uman Poligalan, who's the one that argues in Rav Shimon? It's Rabbi Yehuda. It's Rabbi Yehuda argues, as Rashi says, because he's the bar plukta of Rav Shimon, generally speaking, or how do we know that the one that argues Rav Shimon is Rabbi Yehuda? Because Rabbi Yehuda is mentioned earlier in the Mishnah. So, I'll go upon him. What do we see over here? That he has to say specifically, Rav has to tell us specifically that the halacha is like Rav Shimon. Now, even though he's arguing with Rabbi Yehuda, so man pagala Rabbi Yehuda, v'ha amrat Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. Now, you said based according to our principles that if it's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Rav Shimon, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. Now here he's saying, Rav is saying in this case the halacha is like Rav Shimon. Doesn't that show you and tell you that the klal, that the rule is not correct? Because over here we don't follow this principle. We don't say that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. We say the halacha is like Rav Shimon. El lashma, let's know. Doesn't that show you that we don't apply these klalim? These rules are not correct. Mar says, no, my kusha, what's the kasha? No, maybe in general terms, generally speaking, we do apply these principles. And generally speaking, that's Rav Shimon or Rav Yehuda, the halacha would be like Rav Yehuda. But that's why he has to tell me specifically in this case, this is an exception. This case is an exception, and we paskin over here like Rav Shimon. But who says that we reject this principle? Maybe generally speaking, we do paskin like Rav Yehuda. And the Gemara says, Mehal. Let's bring a right from the following. This time we learned in the Mishnah, Ir shel Yochid and Nas shel Rabbi. If there was a Ir shel Yochid, it became a large city. So the general halacha is as follows. The way Rashi learns a large city and small city, Other Rishonim learn that it's publicly owned or privately owned. But Rashi is learning that there's 600,000 people that or more is a large city, less than 600 is a small city. Now, if you have a city which has 600,000 people or more, and the streets, if they're Tes Zayin Amar or more wide, that's a Rishus HaRabim. You can't make an Eruvin over there. So you can't make a Shitufe Mevus over there. You cannot join the streets together and carry over there because the streets are considered to be Rishus HaRabim. So you can't be Ma'ar of the whole city together. But if you have a small city, and the city is less than 600,000 people, so it doesn't have a din of a Rishus HaRabim Deraisa, then you can be make an Eruv in the whole city. You can be Ma'ar of the whole city, make an Eruv, and make a Shitufe Mevois, and they can carry because it doesn't have a din of a Rishus HaRabim Deraisa. So Midaraisa, it's not Rishus HaRabim, and by making an Eruv, by Ma'ar of it and making an Eruv, then you're allowed to carry. You make a sheet of mavos, you're allowed to carry. Now, if you have a city that is a large city, but some of the streets are not Tesainama, so that they don't have a width of Tesainama, so technically speaking, you should be theoretically allowed to be Ma'ar of the whole city because there's no Rishus HaRabim. Because the streets are too narrow. In order to be Rishus HaRabim, they have to be both Tes Zayin Amar wide, and it has to be, according to at least to this day, it has to be more than 600,000 people. But if you have the streets, which even if the city is a large city, but the streets are not Tes Zayin Amar, it's not Rishus HaRabim, so theoretically you should be able to be Ma'arv it, Ma'arv is Kula. However, he made a takana and said you have to leave out a segment of the city not included the Erev, because otherwise people will think you can be Ma'ar of Rishus HaRabim. So it has to be clear that a segment is not included to the Erev, so people will see that no, the only reason that you're able to be Ma'ar of this city is because the streets that you are included in the Erev are not Rishus HaRabim because they're too narrow. So we learned that Irshal Yachiv and Asashal Rabim, but if it was a small city and became a large city, over there, Marvin is Kula. You could be Ma'ar of the entire city because people will not think that you can be Ma'ar Rishus HaRabim because it has the identity of a small city. Now, even though now it's a large city, but again, if the streets are not Tes Zayin Amar wide, it's still a Rishus HaYachid and it doesn't have the identity of a large city, and it can all be included in the Erev. But Shal Rabim, and that's Shal Yachid, but if it was a large city, even though now it became smaller, so it doesn't have a din of Rishus HaYachid, but still, since people identify it with the Rishus HaRabim, you can't be Ma'ar Meskula. Ein Ma'ar Meskula. You also have to leave out a segment of the city not included into the Erev. Elim Kain Oisa Chutzala, you have to leave out a portion of it not included in the Erev. What's the size? Kir Chadasha should be Yehuda Sheish Bar Chamishim Diurim. Equivalent to a town in the town Chadash of Yehuda, which has 50 residents, 50 inhabitants. That's a minimum size of a city like that city, Chadasha, which is called Chadasha. That is it's the minimum share of a city. So you leave out a segment of that size not included in the Arab. That's the Rabbi Yehuda. That's what Rabbi Yehuda said. But Rosh Hashanah says, no, you don't need so much. He says, Shalosh Chatzeres, Shalosh Shnei Batim. It's sufficient to have 3 Chatzeres that have 2 houses in each one, 2 houses in each, open into it. That's sufficient. That's sufficient enough for a shiur. And he says, halacha like Rosh Hashanah. Now, according to the principles, according to the rule that we had, if it's a machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and Rosh Hashanah, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. And here you see not like that. Here you see we paskin like Rosh Hashanah. So again, doesn't that show you that this principle is not correct? Uman poligaleh Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda, Rav Shimon halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Now, normally, according to the rule, we should say the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. And here, Rav Chaim Bar Goy says the name of Rav, halacha is like Rav Shimon. In fact, again, umay kusha, like we said before. What's the kasha? Now, maybe the same thing over here. We said as before that maybe the principle still applies. Generally speaking, it's Hamach like as Rav Yehuda and Rav Shimon, the halachas like Rav Yehuda. But this is an exception. And here it said clearly that this is an exception. The Ramban is medayik from here. The fact that Rav over here paskins like Rav Shimon, he says, that should teach us, that shows you that Rav does not follow the principle of halacha kedivra mekel be'eruv. Because if we follow the principle of halacha kedivra mekel be'eruv, we should know automatically that the halacha is like Rav Shimon because he's the mekel. So therefore, it would appear to be that he does not follow that principle of halacha kedivra mekel be'eruv, and that's why he has to tell us that the halacha is like Rav Shimon. So Al Kol Panim, the Gemara will now continue on with the discussion. We'll see how do we know that we should reject these principles of the Psak Halacha that we mentioned before.